Background music.
It's background music. All right, we're here and we're going and we're recording. Welcome to our little webinar, Equal but Not the Same Part 2. Myself and Marissa, if you don't know Marissa, she's a superstar life coach that has a background in personal training and working with elite Olympic level athletes, particularly women. And so she's uniquely qualified to speak to both the spiritual and the physical side of this conversation, and is one of the smartest people I know, and has a real passion for bringing this subject to the populace. So I'm really happy that we were able to interrupt her day and get her to share some valuable knowledge with us. The purpose for today is really to go through the cycle again, just to button down on some of the more particulars of the female cycle, and really to bring this conversation to the light. I feel like the female cycle is something that's sort of shunned into the darkness and not talked about. And I think that as a society as a whole, we are worse off because of it. And myself and Marissa, we've done a couple of pre-chats on this, and we're very much in alignment when we're thinking that that your cycle is an opportunity. It's not a negative. It's not an excuse, and it's something that can be explored both from a male perspective, so that you can get the best out of your relationships, and from a female perspective, so you can get the most out of yourself. And today's overview, we're going to have a look at how it impacts you specifically to training. I feel like the last time we did this, it was more from a nutrition lifestyle base, and psychologically, and how those adaptations and maybe framing the different phases of the cycle can really empower the conversation and empower us as a society as a whole. Before we kick off, did you want to add to that at all?
That was a wonderful introduction.
Yeah, sorry, I kind of rambled.
I'm going to make you write. I'm going to get you to write my bios, I think. Yeah, I think I just want to reiterate that I too, believe that the menstrual cycle is an opportunity for us to connect more deeply and intimately with ourselves, and harness not only the physical but also the mental, the psychological and the spiritual aspects for improving our well-being and performance, whether it's in life, in training, in our relationships, in our workplace, and all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, it is. It's really important, and it's a much needed conversation that is underutilized and underspoken about, like you said.
Massively, yeah, massively. I can't believe it's a topic that isn't taught in school, particularly to women, but I feel like it's really valuable for men to understand it as a whole, because every man interacts with women, and every man can do with understanding the process that they go through. So that segues quite nicely onto, I thought what we'd do is we'll touch back on the different phases of the cycle, and go through a basic understanding of it for people that maybe haven't watched the first webinar. And so my brief and understanding of it is that there are two particular phases, follicular and luteal, and they can be broken down further. That we've got, to start with, days sort of 1 to 5, 1 to 7, you've got your bleeds. And then moving through that, we've got the second part of the follicular phase, where you've got your ovaries, and they're starting to produce your eggs, and they start to come on down the fallopian tube, and then into ovulation. Then last part, we've got the luteal phase, and then we cycle back around again. These, last time we classified these as, so it was winter for the bleed, spring for the follicular phase, summer for ovulation, and then autumn for luteal. And that quite nicely illustrates to people what generally is happening in those terms. But when we were talking about it, myself and yourself, Marissa, we sort of wanted to make that a bit more finite, and maybe particularly change the language around what we were talking about in terms of bleeding and follicular, and make it, or summer, winter, autumn. So I might hand this part over to you now, and if you could take us through a little bit on how you see the breakdown of the phases and the transitions through from a psychological archetypal phase. And then maybe what we'll do is we'll then move into how that's going to affect us physically and training.
Yeah, sure. Awesome. I love that. Yeah, and that's a great way to look at it. I think the inner seasons are a really great way to look at it. The other way to look at it is archetypically. And there's quite a lot of information coming out now around cycle syncing and the archetypes. And you can also, for those who are familiar with inner seasons, you can also apply elemental qualities to that, meaning earth, air, fire, and water. And it's a really nice way to, especially for women, but for men as well, because obviously our hormonal profile influences the men in our life, and they go through their own changes of season, perhaps not to the same extent. But archetypically, we can look at, names and labels, which we spoke about, which I'll talk to in a minute. But we can also apply these elemental qualities, these earthly qualities, meaning touching back into your body, or these watery qualities, meaning it's probably going to be a bit more of an emotional time. And so it's really nice to link those things together. I guess as a starting point, understanding what archetypes is and what it really means is where we should begin before going to this. And I think Carl Jung really he was a 20th century psychiatrist who's become quite prolific in the personal development, psychological and philosophical worlds currently, which is great. He basically believed that these identical psychic structures that are typical to all humans exist within parts of our psyche, and that these heritable structures influence the way we think, the way we feel, the way we perceive and experience life, and of course how we behave. And he called these structures, if you like, archetypes, and loosely categorized them as, or loosely described them as cognitive categories or natural inclinations that we're all born with. Okay. The word archetype in ancient Greek language loosely translates to original patterns. So when we're talking about archetypes, we're talking about, I like to think of them as like the personifications of the qualities or energies within us, like putting much like yoga perhaps talks to gods and goddesses. So these archetypes are quite the same. It personifies the certain qualities, like identities, if you like.
Yeah, it gives you an image to sort of bind to as well, much more memorable. Brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. So Carl Jung himself identified 7 of the feminine archetypes, but we're going to stick to the main, or 4 of the main ones.
And we're going to apply those to particular phases of the cycle.
That's right, yeah. And much like the cycle, if you want to get really sciencey with the cycle, you could break it down further from the 2 to the 4 to the 5 or 6, 7 phases.
Yeah.
On average, as women, our hormonal profile changes roughly every 3.5 days, much like the moon phase.
Yeah.
So that 28, 29-day cycle is about 7 to 8 changes, but it's much clearer to put them in the 4 categories that we have, which is what most medical scientific professionals do anyway.
Sure.
So
yeah, for sure.
To start with the first the first part of the cycle, as you said, is the bleed. It's that wise woman phase or our inner winter, and it's really associated with the earthly element. So this, when we tap into our wise woman potential, this part of the menstrual phase can be a really strong period of deep reflection, deep healing and growth. The wise woman as an archetype is like a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. She's very introspective. She's tuned into her intuition. She has managed to turn her pains and her wounds and her shadows and trauma into wisdom, so that she can now speak her truth, know her power, and share that with others.
Great.
And of
So if you're
course,
orientating your life, sorry, but if you're orientating your life around your cycle and you're honoring your wise woman for that, pardon the pun, period of time, what is it that you would be, what type of behaviors would be you moving towards?
what type of, sorry, it cut out then.
Behaviors, sorry.
Yeah, so from a psychological perspective, it's a really great time to reflect, and whether that's reflecting on work projects. Also, a pun intended here was sometimes in life it's time to put a period where the comma was,
Right.
and that could be in relationships, in work projects. It's a time where we go inwards. We start to do things that are connecting ourselves back with our body, journaling, gardening, connecting with the earth, doing yoga,
Yeah.
a lot of self-reflection, and really
Planning
embrace.
time?
And
Good planning time?
not a bad planning time, but best planning comes sort of after, when we
Right.
move into the next phase.
Yeah.
It is a great time to start to plant some seeds. If you look at the moon phase, it'll be the dark moon. So it is a good time to plant some seeds. It's not such a great time for action.
Yeah. Okay.
More reflection and release. What is really interesting around this time from a physical perspective, but also mental, emotional perspective, is a lot of the narrative we hear about people having their period is that we're moody and we need to be all on our own and left alone. And that's can be true in some respect, especially for the first day or two. But after day 2 and into day 3, 4, perhaps day 5, depending on how long your period goes for, your bleed goes for, we actually start to become really mentally attuned. We become less emotional. We start to feel strong again. Our spatial skills.
Because am I right in saying there that at that point, hormonally, your testosterone, progesterone, estrogen are all sort of flatlining after the first few days, and so at that point, that's why you've got this sort of steady stream of consciousness almost, and yeah, it's a good time to get shit done.
100%, and it's a good time to get the inner stuff done. And that inner stuff is really inner reflection. Because we're not at the, especially unconsciously, we're not at the whim of those hormonal fluctuations, if you like.
Yeah, sure.
So to break the stigma around having or bleeding and having a period, it's usually the first day or two that we really want to be really gentle with ourselves.
Yeah.
And after that, we can start to, continue to reflect inwards and self-care and self-nourish, because our inflammation markers will be up. We will, C-reactive protein and that sort of stuff are elevated. So it's still a good time to self-care, but mentally and emotionally speaking, we'll actually start to feel more clear and more like, oh, I want to go now. So it's a great time to start going, what do I want to create over the next month?
Great.
What are my goals? What are my intentions? What seeds will I plant? And then when we move into the next phase, we can start actually getting creative and preparing and planning for that.
Nice. So just to summarize,
physically wise, really good to do some strength training in this stage, because we feel strong, just not too much of it or too intense.
So not high volumes. So we spoke a little bit about.
Frozen a bit.
Oh, yeah, that happened here as well. Can you hear me now? Right. So anyway, myself and Marissa, as long as this is still recording, spoke a little bit about reframing these 4 different parts of and phases of the cycle. We'll get Marissa back in a minute. These 4 different parts of the cycle in terms of, so with the bleed and the wise woman being the archetype of the bleed, then rather than calling it the bleed, empowering it as being this emotionally intelligent time, and qualifying it as an emotional intelligence, having that in your diary. That's the time that I'm going to be looking for personal growth, maturity. I'm going to be still doing stuff and actioning it. And we've just got those first sort of 1 to 3 days where we're going to look to really work inwards and, eat warm foods and do yogic type movements. And then, but then for the last sort of 3 to 4 days, you're then looking at journaling and setting yourself up for the months to come. Here we go. And so where we go to next post bleed is you move into your follicular phase. And what I might do is, whilst we get Marissa back, if I just share, hello dear, don't worry. Yeah, we lost it all, but I just went through qualifying with the guys what it was that we were, how it is that we were qualifying the different phases. So the wise woman was this emotional intelligence. It's this opportunity for growth and to journey inwards. And the reframing of that conversation rather than just, it's the bleed, I can do nothing with my time now. Okay, so you can see on your screens now the fluctuation that the female hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone go through from day one right the way through to the end. So we've done the menstruation, the bleed, the wise woman. We're now moving into the follicular phase, where things start to get a little bit crazier, but again, you've got this real opportunity. So I will stop that share. I just wanted to share that so that you could really view it. I mean, for me, it was a real aha moment when I first saw this table, and you're like, okay, now things start to make a little bit more sense, right? When you see the lines going all over the place, you can see that really physically, emotionally, spiritually, you're going to be very, very different. Well, like Marissa said, every 3 to 4 days, potentially. And again, it is probably worth reminding everybody that we're only talking of women that actually are having a full cycle. So people that are on the pill, although you can get sort of phantom bleeds and fluctuations, it's not the same. So this is really the conversation that we're having. Anyway, I will pass it back to Marissa to take us through the follicular phase or spring.
So the follicular phase is the fun phase, right? Because all of a sudden we're tapping into this maiden energy, and this maiden energy perhaps with a little bit of a lover energy imbued.
So Maiden's the archetype that we were talking about before.
Yeah, and this the maiden archetype is really representative of what you guys would have spoken about last time in the spring season, and the quality of air. So it's youthful and enthusiastic and excited about life and energized. And the maiden as an archetype's quality has this ability to embrace her own inner power and authenticity, and so she becomes magnetic.
And this makes so much sense, right? As you're moving towards ovulation, when this moment of life creation, that you'd have this youthful, exuberant type energy in order to, laws of attraction gravitate men towards you to be able to go through this procreation process. So yeah, I mean, that all ties together, spring, air, maiden, archetype. That's, makes sense.
Yeah, and with the air element, it's really about honoring your mind and your thoughts, right? So at this part of the cycle, energy increases, mental acuity increases, mental alertness, how our brain works increases. And so those verbal skills that we feel like we might lose a little bit before we start menstruating, we get our period, they all come back. So our brain's really sharp. It's a great time to problem solve and get really creative and be brave at taking on new tasks, especially mentally challenging tasks, and embracing new experiences. You know, this is the time where you get creative, you make a plan based on the intentions you set during your bleed, and you start to get action orientated. So that screen that you had before with the hormonal profiles, you'll start to see that as the hormones increase, testosterone increases as well. So much like in men, there's a lot more motivation. You feel more motivated. You start to feel more energized, and, you know, starting to move towards that ovulation phase, start to feel more sexy, more empowered, more social. You know, it's a good time to get out and mingle and, you know, do all of those great fun things like you would do after winter in the spring. It's like, yes, the sun's back out, let's go play.
Yeah, fantastic. And I really feel like this is probably worth dropping into the conversation now. But so it often when we're talking about the cycle, it's only in this negative context. Oh, a woman's about to get her period, she must be getting PMS and going all crazy, right? And by honoring these processes and understanding them, and then so really doubling down on personal growth in phase one, personal development and action in phase two, and we're going to go through the next couple of phases as well. You're really moving your life forward at a much greater rate, right? If you can get your time to your work, your training, your nutrition, your relationship timetables around this, then symptomatically everything starts to subside as well, right? Because hormonally you don't go through these huge fluctuations. I think often misrepresented is how important your relationships and the interactions that we have on a daily basis, not just with each other, but with the planet, with the food, with your sleep, they all combine to give us greater fluctuations, and therefore have much more problematic periods. And so I think, it was just what you were just saying just triggered my memory for that. It was like, I was like, yeah, it's a really powerful tool for us to be utilizing. And I really think with any client, the biggest thing that I can do is behavioral change. So that's why I wanted to double back and really nail down on what it is that you're talking about with these archetypes, and how we can action these and honor these archetypes with our behavior and with our planning as to what it is that we're doing on a week-to-week, day-to-day, month-to-month basis.
Yeah, and a big part of that, you talked to the point about relationships, a big part of that is the relationship we have with ourselves and the way we speak to ourselves and the expectations we place on ourselves.
Yes.
I work a lot predominantly with women, and it's really interesting that those who aren't deeply connected with their cycle and the changes within their cycle always revert back to, not always, but very often revert back to this maiden archetype. And this part of the follicular phase is like, I feel motivated, inspired and driven. I'm really clear on my purpose is, where I'm going and what I'm doing. And then it all falls apart.
Yeah.
Like, it's not really falling apart. You just move through that phase, and you're wanting to stay in that phase without embracing the qualities and the superpowers.
And then that's when that self-talk starts happening, that self-doubt, that lack of self-love. Oh, I'm useless, I'm terrible, I'm unmotivated, I'm lazy. And it's like, you just haven't honored the process. That's all. Right? You're none of those things.
Yeah, and it cascades into poor decisions around eating. As soon as we start eating things that don't make us feel alive and nourished, we stop going to the gym. And we're starting to, these are behavioral, but they're also having an effect on our biology, our nervous system, our inflammatory markers, and our psychology, right? So it's all interlinked in that.
100%. And over years and years of this is going to snowball into being a massive thing. It's the same as weight gain. 1 kilo every year over a 20-year period, and suddenly you're 20 kilos overweight. And looking at how this happened. And so, this is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this subject, because 50% of the planet is female. It's 3.5 billion people. And in our culture, we really just don't talk about this. So then you've just got 3.5 billion, or 50% of our country's 13 million, not understanding and feeling like they're the problem. And it's just lack of understanding, lack of knowledge around it. Okay, so
and it shows up in relationships. She's great for the first 2 weeks of her month, and then just leave her alone. And there's this conflict that happens. It's the same as overly produced and overly farmed fruit and veggies. We're eating summer fruits all of the year round. What's that doing to our earth? This is a fractal of a bigger conversation as well. So
totally. I mean, and we are nature, and therefore if we're having a war with nature, we're having a war with ourselves, and vice versa. So back on track, follicular phase, spring, moving into and maiden, actionable stuff through that phase. Then we're going into our ovulation, right? Summertime.
Actionable stuff for the follicular phase. get social, get creative, make a plan, take action.
Yeah.
Make the most of taking action when you're in that space, because then when we move into the ovulatory phase, which is personified by the huntress archetype, which is beautiful and does imbue. Yeah, it's so.
I feel like there's a movie there somewhere, straight away.
I'm sure there is.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's already
badass
a movie
huntress.
there.
Yeah.
This is the element of fire, right? This is about honoring our heart, honoring and not heart from the emotional space that we sometimes connect those two things, but honoring our heart from a more spiritual perspective and our inner fire, our passions, the things that we get like really excited about. Little caveat to this stage is it is a time where for the learning or the superpower, it's about being bold and embodied in our expression. It's a really emboldening and embodiment time. It's where we're brave and we're able to take on new challenges, ask for what we want, say the things that are important. The caveat to this is that we can get really fiery in this stage, and sometimes that can move into a shadow of that archetype, which can be a bit bossy or demeaning. So it's just to be mindful of that, of how to, much like an actual fire, we don't want to build a massive bonfire and go off and half an hour later we've got nothing left. We want to be able to stoke it and manage that fire.
And that's, I guess, part of this understanding process, isn't it? I want to just wind back a little bit because we can always get caught up in conversations on this level, and people may not understand, and I'm not fully across it. You mentioned shadow archetypes. I think it's worth mentioning there that there are two sides to these archetypes, right? There's and we're sort of mainly espousing the positive sides of it. So if you're really deep and honoring your huntress, this is who you're going to be. But maybe you could talk about what it is that's a shadow side and what that means, and why somebody might be in their shadow side and why that might not be a good thing. Sorry, just loaded you up there, but yeah.
No, that's beautiful. I think, and it's a really powerful question, because our shadow element, or the shadow aspects of us, are very powerful because they're out of the conscious realm of knowing. Therefore, it's where we're reactive.
Right.
Our shadows become active when we react rather than are present and respond.
Sure.
And so the shadows of these archetypes are really, there's a bit of a dualistic thought form around it that they're bad. Shadows bad, light is good. But it's actually not so much that they're bad, they're just being denied or repressed or rejected for some reason. So they're the less spoken about, the less accessible, and the less that people really like, because they're not, honey attracts the bees, right? It's not.
Yeah, for sure.
But there's so much potency and power in those shadow elements as well. And it is like, to go through all the shadows of each of these archetypes is probably a whole nother session, which I'd like to do. Page, but it's
well, I mean, it gives us an idea for the next one, but maybe if we could just have a brief example of what the light side of I think the Maiden's a really good one, is if you give me the brief synopsis of a positive Maiden, and then if you're not honoring that, and you mentioned, I think it was with the wise woman, or even if the women that aren't honoring any part of their cycle often revert back to the shadow part of the Maiden. So what does that look like? So that we can identify it.
Yeah, the shadow part of the Maiden is the part of the feminine that many people are, unfortunately, perhaps familiar with, which is people pleasing.
Right.
Yeah. The shadow aspects of the Maiden can be very shallow, very judgmental, but also very obedient from a place of not being authentic to herself and wanting to please others.
Got you.
Yeah.
So totally.
It's really about embracing your yeses and your nos and honoring those in a very playful, beginner's mind, confident kind of way that you would expect a Maiden to be, rather than the shrunk, small, people pleaser, subdued kind of Maiden.
And it seems to me, it does. It seems to me to be almost a maturation process, right? Like you start as this young child and you contain all these archetypes. And then as we grow up, these archetypes all mature into being their fullest self.
That's right.
And yet actually what happens with a lot of people is certain aspects of their personality or certain sides of these archetypes don't fully mature, and therefore they exhibit those traits. Is that an accurate way of framing it?
Absolutely. And to go even deeper into Jung's world, he suggests that there's an active and a passive part of the shadow.
Right.
And the passive part is more the weaker, subdued side, which over time then becomes active, explosive in behavior. And through the integration of that active side of the shadow, so we're seeing the behaviors that we're like, oh, I don't know why I did or said that.
Yeah.
And we integrate them. And this is the thing overarching this conversation, that if it's the only thing that people take with them, especially women, is we have this beautiful gift that every single month, even if you are on the contraceptive pill, even if you have gone through menopause, we still go through these cycles at a different level.
Yeah.
We have an opportunity every single month to really go and reflect, where was I triggered? Where are my shadow attributes coming through? What can I change, and how can I mature? We get to do that every month.
Yeah.
We get an opportunity to do that every month, to mature mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and progress physically if we really start to honor these.
And a great place to check in would be right at the start, right? For the wise woman, our period of emotional intelligence and the bleeds. Okay, beautiful. So we've moved through ovulation now. And then we're into our luteal phase, autumn.
Yes, autumn. So this is the wild woman. I guess the shadow, just to backtrack a little bit, the shadow of that huntress really is about, as I said, minding the fire, making sure you're not becoming controlling or attracting drama, because the huntress really is attracting a mate. She's ovulating.
Right.
Yeah, she knows what she wants, and she wants to procreate and all of those beautiful things. It also means that, like any light, mozzies come as well. So be careful not to attract drama, which can then activate another shadow where we push people away.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's this
I think it's such an important part of this conversation. I know we're diving down it a little bit, but to framing behavioral change, like I said before, is one of the biggest components of getting anywhere in life. And to understand, to have this framework of behavioral patterns personified is really is easy to remember and easy to then navigate your way through, which I think, just as a sort of brief sidetrack, is why we keep on coming back to this and why we're sort of taking this deep dive down this route. Okay, so follicular autumn.
Wild woman, follicular phase. This is the phase. This is a long phase. In that two-part model, this phase can go from 10 to 17 days, but as we break it down, it's a little less.
Yep.
But this is the phase that a lot of the narratives of women getting their period have arisen from, because if anyone here knows about the goddesses, this is the Kali energy, right? And I'm going to start with this one as the shadows. The shadow of this wild woman archetype is chaotic, unpredictable, can be destructive. This is the death part of the cycle, or the dying part of the cycle, the destruction part of the cycle. Yeah. So this is where she's crazy. Back in the days of early psychology, this was the phase called hysteria, where a lot of women would actually be institutionalized for hysteric outbreaks because of the emotional fluctuation triggered by these hormonal changes.
Yeah.
So in the wild woman's fullness, and this luteal phase really is an opportunity for us to become really present and really self-aware, especially of our emotional changes. Again, the element of this is water, which is representative of
change.
Yeah.
Never being still, never forming one.
Yeah, 100%. So the opportunity is presence and self-awareness, but also really tapping into that playful, liberated, wild part, untamed part of our feminine, right? And this is true for men as well. And so awakened and untamed, this archetype is fierce. This is where we challenge the status quo. You know, we're deeply connected to our intuition, really self-assured, very confident, but we need solitude, and we need to start to focus in this phase on our inner fulfillment. This is where in a lot of ancient cultures, red tents started to be assembled, where women's circles and women would gather leading up to their period to self-nurture and care for each other, you know, to really help regulate those emotional fluctuations, which can be destructive and chaotic, hysteric.
Yeah, totally. And I
Yeah.
think from a training and lifestyle perspective, this is commonly where I see women start to really struggle and blame themselves, because your caloric needs go up and your energy and motivation levels go down. So you're eating the same and putting on weight and not able to do anything about it because you're feeling rubbish. And so it's really a good time to understand that and to moderate your expectations around diet and exercise. So yeah, you can, and this is why we'll only ever test strength test monthly, and we'll get to this in a minute because we'll go through the training aspects of it. But because from last week where you felt amazing to this week, your training, your nutrition, your relationships, everything's going to change, and that's okay. That's the opportunity within, and I think that's what I want to try and get across today, is that none of this is negative. The bleed, the luteal phase, none of it is a bad thing. It's all an opportunity for us to understand and nurture, and therefore really supercharge. And you actually have a great quote to close it out on what this is. Do you want to maybe dive into that?
Yeah, I think just to finish on that phase especially, and to loop it back with what you said quickly, this is really where we get to honor our emotions. And the more we get to feel our emotions and not wish them to be dumped something different, the less we have that crappy energy, crappy food, inflammation type of response. So,
and that's where the period pains and everything really start to go through the roof, right? Because you don't honor these things, you do start to eat the shitty food, you do get more inflammation, blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, and the great thing about that, just from a relationship perspective, even if you're not in a relationship, a lot of the inflammatory responses and the chaotic responses in that phase can be eliminated through accessing your sexual prowess in your ovulation phase through having really substantial and satisfying orgasms.
You mentioned this the other day. This I found fascinating. Can we double down on this a little bit? Can you explain this?
Yeah, so I mean, primarily speaking, we're driven by our nervous system on a level, right?
Yeah.
And so we're biologically designed to find a mate and procreate over time. And so to procreate, ovulation obviously is the time where we want to, you know, do that. And so, yeah, it's easier for women to orgasm. Our uterus sits lower, our sexual desires are higher, our hormones are completely ready for us to make babies. Even if we don't want to make babies, we still have this innate desire. And so our nervous system is priming us to have these beautiful, fulfilling, satisfying sexual encounters during ovulation. Reward systems.
Do it again. You guys should definitely have sex at this time of the month again. How fucking awesome was it?
It's really interesting
We're
that, you
so
know,
unconscious on so many levels.
Yeah. And this phase, like women's sex drive tends to decline when they're not in touch with their menstrual cycle. But if you can really harness that at ovulation, your sex drive increases during the latter phases of your menstrual cycle. And it's a time where you're not looking for the end game or satisfaction, it's playfulness.
Sure.
fun, right? And so that basically is a function of our nervous system saying that we have achieved that goal of satisfaction, because primarily speaking, if we were satisfied, especially, you know, for women, it meant that the mate was a good one, and therefore we would genetically be passing on healthy genes to the child.
Totally. Yeah.
Yes, if we can harness
And it
that
was also symptomatically through the luteal phase got better too, right?
yeah, because the nervous system was happier, so to
Yeah.
speak, the inflammatory responses reduced. It wasn't so anxiously looking for a mate still, because that's basically what the nervous system is doing, is it's anxiously trying to find someone to procreate with. So
Yeah.
if that's satisfied, the nervous system can switch back down into a bit more of a balanced state and work optimally rather than spiking all of the
And
hormones.
for the single ladies out there that are watching this, it doesn't have to be penile stimulated, right?
That's right.
This can
That's
be
right.
a solo expedition.
Yeah, and I would even suggest, even if you have a partner, make it a solo expedition, perhaps with them as well. Like, the more women can get in touch with their bodies sexually as well, their pleasure centers, and what brings them that satisfaction and deep fulfillment and joy and all of that sort of stuff. Obviously, the healthier relationship you're going to be, but your menstrual cycle is also going to be much more easy to navigate.
Yeah.
As so, you know, there's a lot of health benefits
Opportunities
as well.
everywhere.
Yeah.
Uh,
So
right.
to finish with that quote, yeah, there's a
Mm.
traditional Native American saying that says, at her first bleed, a woman meets her power. And then during her bleeding years, she practices it. And at menopause, she becomes it. And I really love that, because I do believe that our menstrual cycle is an opportunity to connect more intimately with ourselves.
I
And
agree.
if we can pair that up by harnessing the characteristics of those archetypes, you know, we do get to tap into those innate superpowers that, you know, improve our well-being, our performance, our relationships, you know, the most important things in life. So super powerful. We have a
I
superpower. We've got to use
We
it.
all do. This is the thing. Men have it in terms of honoring their women and lifting them up, because then consciously that lifts us all up. And so, yeah, I'm on board. I think that's a great place to sort of sign off. We have put together a PDF that does dive down into the training side of things a little bit more, but basically to summarize it, you can do whatever you want. You can do, you just need to understand the phase that you're in, and then best honor that and reflect that within your training, right? So if we're doing, say we're in class and we're doing deadlifts that day, if it's the first few days of your bleed, you can still deadlift. If you really want to, you can still deadlift. But the opportunity there is probably to go reduce the volume.
Yep.
That's it. Yeah, maybe you want to do
just look for technique a little bit more around the
yeah,
ovulation phase, because we do
yeah.
get a little bit more relaxin in the joints, so we're more susceptible to
And there's some
injury.
inflammation around the organs, so contracting the core is a little bit harder. So yeah, it's definitely there's an opportunity there, and we have this all written down in the PDF. So anybody that's wanting that, then I can send that through to them, or we'll drop it into the group. Marissa, thank you so much for taking time out of your day.
Thanks for having me.
No, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Not today.
No, I think we
There's
covered
a whole rabbit hole that we could go down there. So I think that was,
yeah,
I think
so many tributaries.
and
But yeah, maybe we'll do
really
a follow-up.
honor that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Given. Pleasure.